friends, and welcome back. My name is Elizabeth, and today I'm talking about nostalgia. Specifically, how to capture the feeling of nostalgia in your writing without relying on callbacks to previous media or real-life historical events that your readers might be aware of. So, first things first, the reason I wanted to make this video is because the book I'm writing now is supposed to be a fun, magical adventure, and I want it to invoke that feeling of nostalgic childhood emotions in the reader. And while they're reading, I want them to feel that particular magic of nostalgia, that warmth and hope and feeling of community and sense of belonging. So, because I want to work this feeling into my novel, I've been doing research on how to best do so. And then I decided that I would share what I found with you all, other writers who might be doing the same thing, so we can learn together. Because that is more fun than learning alone. So, because my book is a fantasy set in a fantasy world, I knew I wouldn't be relying on any standard elements of nostalgia. Like, I couldn't just pepper my books with references to real things that my readers might have experienced and enjoyed. In order to hack their own senses of nostalgia, I would have to create that feeling of nostalgia from scratch. And that's what I really wanted to do anyway. I didn't want to just exploit nostalgia for the sake of manipulating my readers' emotions. That does not sound enjoyable. So, I've broken this down into 3 categories. First, what is nostalgia? What are its benefits and drawbacks? Second, what does nostalgia feel like for the person who is experiencing it, i.e., your reader? And finally, third, how do I translate that into my own writing? So that's what this video will cover. I'll also link some of the videos I watched about nostalgia down below so you can watch them yourself if you want to, which I encourage you to do so because it's actually really fascinating to study. So, number 1, what is nostalgia? Well, according to Merriam-Webster, nostalgia is a wistful or excessively sentimental yearning for return to or of some past period or irrecoverable condition, or the state of being homesick. Which is really interesting because apparently nostalgia was first identified in the 17th century in soldiers, who so desperately longed to return home that they developed physical symptoms, which sometimes led to them having to be discharged from the military. And for a long time after that, nostalgia was thought of as an affliction, as a sickness. But modern psychology now recognizes that nostalgia plays an important role in a person's life, not just a negative role, especially during difficult periods in that person's life. People rely on nostalgia to remind them of better times, to remember what it felt like to live in those better times, and to maintain hope in the future. But that last little bit is especially important. Nostalgia is beneficial when it allows a person to hold on to their identity, to remind themselves of who they are and where they have been in life, and also to survive more difficult periods of their life. But nostalgia stops being beneficial when you get stuck in the past, where instead of using your past to help craft your current identity, you feel like you have no identity except for what happened in the past, when you have no hope for the future. And when the strength and comfort that comes from remembering who you are and where you have been doesn't translate into you forging ahead to better times, but instead stops you in despair over lost times. This dichotomy of positive and negative emotions associated with nostalgia can be exploited in 2 distinct ways, when it comes to writing and also just in general. First, it can make people believe the past is better than the present, and that the future is terrifying unless we rebuild the past, rather than trying to imagine a new and better future. This type of exploitation of nostalgia can lead to huge groups of people fervently believing that everything good in our lives is already behind us, and the only way to stop the fear of the future is by doing everything possible to turn back time, to refuse to imagine new ways of living in the world. And that's dangerous. But the second way that nostalgia can be exploited is especially pertinent to writers. And that is by taking that same belief that everything good has already happened, that it's in the past, and the only way to enjoy the present is by clinging to old stories and retelling them over and over again in order to milk those nostalgia endorphins for all they're worth. That is how we end up with story after story that is either a blatant remake or so packed with callbacks to familiar stories that all the tension gets sucked from the story. The audience can guess the end, and they get bored. I didn't want to do this in my story, and since I set the story in a fantasy world, I knew I wouldn't be calling back to known stories, since those stories don't exist in this world. I just wanted to create the experience of nostalgia for the reader, on the pleasant side, without actually tapping into their own specific nostalgia-inducing moments and memories. So, to do that, it brings me to section number 2. What does nostalgia feel like? Now, this is particularly in reference to your reader. What will your reader feel like when they are experiencing nostalgia invoked by your writing? Not necessarily what you need or even want your characters to be experiencing. We're thinking about the reader. Does that make sense? Well, to confuse you even further, the way I went about determining what my reader would feel, I returned to the old handy-dandy Emotion Thesaurus by Angela Angela Ackerman and Becca Puglisi, which is a book intended to help writers express how their characters feel. But oh well, I'm using it to try and figure out what emotional experience I want my reader to have while reading my book. So here we go. For every emotion in this thesaurus, the authors provide you with a definition, physical signs of the emotion, internal sensations, mental responses, cues of long-term experience of the emotion, and what that might lead to, as well as cues that the emotion is being suppressed. I mean, really, this is one of the most useful books a writer can have. If you don't have one already, I highly suggest you pick one up. It goes that in-depth for 75 different emotions. I bet you can't even name 75 different emotions. Anyway, according to the emotion thesaurus, some of the physical signs of nostalgia are an unfocused gaze, a slight smile, a relaxed posture, eyes that fill with tears, rubbing a hand against a heart, seeking out those who shared the event, seeing similarities in the present, and increased tenderness, among many others. Internal sensations include an excited flutter in the belly, dulled awareness, such as sitting in an uncomfortable position without realizing it, and experiencing the same physical sensations felt during the past event. These are the feelings and experiences I want to invoke in the reader just by having them read my story. The mental responses to nostalgia include losing track of time and satisfaction at having experienced the event despite any pain or loss resulting from it. Cues of long-term nostalgia include discontent with the way things presently are, expressing more emotion about the past than the present, and neglecting current duties or relationships, all which might lead to depression. This is where nostalgia can go wrong and stop being beneficial. And I don't want to cause this experience in the reader. I want them fully immersed in the story, and I want them to experience the feeling of nostalgia in such a way that connects them with themselves and with other people at an emotional level. And finally, according to the emotion thesaurus, cues of suppressed nostalgia include not engaging in conversations about the past and masking nostalgia with practicality. For example, by saying, "I kept his toys so he could give them to his kids." This is a person unwilling to engage with the past, potentially because the present is so painful and the future is so scary. I don't want to exclude this person from experiencing my novel. Ideally, I'd really like my novel to be gentle enough that this type of person could experience the feeling of nostalgia for long enough that they could tolerate it for long enough to gain some of its benefits, like a more positive sense of self and a stronger feeling of community. Which brings me to section number 3. How do I translate this information into my writing? This is the trickiest part, and it's the part I'm still working on in my own novel. But since I'm not relying on known events or familiar stories to call back to just name drop for my readers in order to hack their own sense of nostalgia, I instead want to foster the experience of nostalgia by creating a story that makes the reader feel a sense of belonging, a feeling of optimism, and a steady warmth and belief in themselves that allows them to push forward in their lives, to get through difficult times and to remember who they are and where they have been, and to feel like they aren't alone in that experience. That is the goal. It's a big goal, possibly unreachable, but I have to try. I want to try. It seems so lofty that it's difficult to pinpoint specific ways to achieve this experience, but some of the things I'm trying to do in my novel is foster a strong sense of self by developing a highly complex, relatable protagonist who's telling her story in first-person present tense to keep the reader right in the moment, and I'm also trying to use a really deep point of view to really allow the reader to experience the world the way the protagonist is. I'm trying to access her true sense of humanity rather than just expressing her thoughts and actions for the reader to observe. Second, in order to foster a strong sense of community for the reader, I'm spending a lot of time trying to develop the specific relationship dynamics between each of the characters in the book, both to each other and also to the group as a whole that is active in the book. I want the relationships in the story and the group dynamics to feel real enough to the reader that they can easily slip in to feeling like they are actually part of the group. That these are real people in the story, and that by rooting for them, the reader is also rooting for themselves. Now, for the final part of this, for capturing that specific hope that nostalgia can invoke, I haven't quite figured out what I want to do to achieve that, but I think it will have to do with surprise. The world of the story would be a safe place, and the characters would feel real and familiar. But in order to foster that feeling of bravery that nostalgia offers, that you can survive difficult times in order to create an even better future, I feel like that will require some element of subverting expectation. Because I think the easier route would be to leave that section off, and to allow the book to fully revel in the rose-colored glasses of times gone by, without offering any meaningful hope for the future. And I don't want to do that. I think we developed the ability to experience nostalgia for a reason, and that reason is to allow us to re-experience positive emotions, even during much darker times, and to use that motivation of longing and familiarity to build an even better future. to remind ourselves of everything we've done and everything we still can do.